Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. Transferring the family farm is so much more than just a simple business transaction, and there are a number of complex issues to be addressed. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, I'm joined by Teagasc Financial Management Specialist James McDonnell with some key advice to help farm families through this process and all aspects that need to be considered when writing a succession plan. James, before we start, perhaps you could go through what the terms succession, inheritance and farm transfer actually mean and how they differ.
So succession is really, it's the handover of the farm business, really. It's the management of what's going on the farm. Inheritance is actually the legal transfer of the ownership of the assets to the next generation. So when we use the term farm transfer, it's almost a combination of both. You're transferring the farm business and possibly the assets as well. So it's succession and inheritance together. So you wonder, different people use the different terms and they switch them around. So I suppose we call our events succession and inheritance events. So you might be doing one or the other or both. Some farmers will hand over the assets, but they'll continue farming with their children. So they're doing the inheritance part, they're doing the succession part, but they might also be changing from being a manager to a worker. So that happens too. So every family has a different, I suppose, way of looking at it. And I suppose the events are about helping families to make a plan, how to keep the business going, how to keep income for the family, and that it all works well, that there's no rows or disagreements.
It's something that probably a lot of farmers put off, James, but for farmers listening, I think one of the first questions will be, where do I start?
Yeah, good question, Catherine. The place to start really is with a will. We heard lots of talk during the Brexit negotiations about a backstop. So a will really is your backstop. If the unforeseen happens, you drop dead, what happens? Your assets. If you don't have a will, you're following the Succession Act of 1965. So it depends on who's left behind you. So if you have a spouse, your spouse gets everything. If there's a spouse and children, there's a 2/3, 1/3 rule. So you're not getting the decision. It's taken out of your hands as to what happens. So if you want to give, one child a site and another child a bit of money and another child a specific field, well, the best way to do that is in a will. And if you're not sure what to do, I suppose write a temporary will while you're negotiating with the family what each of them want. So that's the best place to start. Write a will. You can always update it after a few years. And if your children are young, you'll have to update it anyway when they probably reach age 21. And, I went through the process myself, wrote a will when I had a child born, then it was the second child. So I had to update the will, and the solicitor told me that we need to update it again when the youngest is age 20. So there are tax implications. So a will is the place to start. And then you can work on through your farm succession plan. I suppose, there's lots of information out there about, farm succession. There's lots of it on our website. And I suppose that's why we're chatting here today is to try and work through that and where you can find some of the information. But to my mind, a will is the place to start, and only 50% of the population probably have one made.
I think you touched on it there, James. Really, it's really the farming family as a whole. And what are the key questions that farmers would need to ask?
Well, I suppose there's a lot of questions. I mean, some farmers say that they want to retire. And what do they mean by retire? Sometimes I think it's they want to hand the assets over to their child. They just want to do that part. Other farmers will say they never want to retire, but really they do want to hand over the assets. They just want to continue working on the farm. So everybody has their own definition. So I suppose farm families, and farmers need to decide what they want as they get on in years. Some people are worried about the Fair Deal scheme, and that's going through, changes are going through the houses of the Oireachtas at the moment. And, we're hoping maybe to discuss that on our webinars. how do you, if you're going to hand over the farm to the next generation, what do you do for an income? Maybe you'll have care needs down the road, and who covers the cost of that, or how is it funded? If you're young and there's a short generation gap from yourself as the farmer to the next generation, how do you get two incomes out of the one farm? So there's partnership options there, and maybe your son or daughter would join you in the business, and maybe you'd take on some extra land and grow the business so that there are two incomes. There's tax implications attached to transferring land. So there's 3 taxes that you need to watch out for. There's capital gains tax, stamp duty, and capital acquisitions tax. And poorly planned succession can result in large tax bills. So I suppose it's important, once you have the first step done and you have the will made, that you sit down with the family and work out, who's getting what, how people are going to be cared for, where the income is going to come from. And then you talk to your accountant and come up with the tax angles. What's this going to cost in terms of tax? And if there's going to be a lot of tax, maybe there's a way of tweaking the plan to minimize the tax. Because the last thing you want to do is, give some land to a child and they having to sell a portion of it to cover a tax bill. That doesn't make any sense. That's, creating leakage in the system. So it's important to meet your accountant. You also maybe some of the smaller farmers that have, struggling to make an income, they want to be sure that they're making PRSI payments so that they have a pension, a contributory pension, rather than the means tested pension. So it's important to look at pensions. So there's lots of different angles. And I suppose, we covered some of those on a webinar that we did last year, and people can log on to our website and they can review that webinar. It's about an hour long, took place last November. So that's still live there on the Teagasc YouTube channel. All of the information is still current until maybe the next tax budget when there might be slight changes. But it's worth people's while watching that webinar. It'll tee them up maybe, with some questions that they might want to ask at our next 2 webinars that are coming up in October.
Yes, James, I think you've covered a lot of points there with relation to the tax implications and a lot of the business issues. But I suppose an important point to remember is that there's a huge support network there available to start the transfer process. And you've touched on some of the people, but who else do farmers need to be in contact with to start the transfer process?
Well, I suppose, there's a number of different professionals, and I suppose oftentimes people start with ourselves. So the client will come in to you and they'll say, Catherine, I'm thinking of retiring from farming. What should I do? And I suppose the first thing is to figure out a plan. Who's getting what? How are all the children to be looked after? How are you going to look after yourself in later life in terms of income and all the rest of it? So that's about writing a plan. And if it's difficult to have the conversation, with your children, maybe you'll use a mediator. So mediators can help families reach a plan. An advisor, I suppose we're science trained, so our soft skills mightn't be the best because we know how to grow grass and what AI straws to use and design buildings. So this might be a little bit outside our comfort zone, but an advisor is a good place to start. So talk to your advisor. Maybe a mediator might be needed. Once you have a kind of a plan in place, you need to sit down with your accountant to work out the tax implications. Then it's about, going to the solicitor and doing the legal transfer. If a legal transfer is what's going to be done, or if it's a farm partnership, solicitors and accountants are working together. You might also want to talk to Citizens Information, who provide an invaluable service in relation to the Fair Deal scheme, pension entitlements. You might want to talk to the Department of Social Protection to find out what your PRSI history is in terms of what payments have you made down through the years, how many PRSI payments do you still need to make to get a full pension, or will you get a partial pension? Mediators to be contacted through, the MII is their website, so themii.ie. You can pick up a mediator in your local area if you're struggling with the conversation or there's some conflict. And finally, I'd say valuations need to be done as there's a tax calculation. So the services of an auctioneer may be required to value all the properties. And even for the person receiving the property, if they have other property themselves, everything needs to be valued to do the tax calculation. So I suppose there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there nearly, Catherine. Start with your advisor, then involve a mediator if required, the accountant, the solicitor, citizens information, Department of Social Protection, and an auctioneer. So there's a good team of professionals. And maybe you decide that you don't want to retire yet, and you might decide to reduce your farming, and it might be to go land leasing, or you might decide to plant some forestry. So, if you're looking at those options, it's probably something that your local advisor can help you with. So I suppose don't be afraid to ask. There's a lot more people involved in this area than you would expect.
Yeah, I suppose, James, you touched on it there. It is a difficult conversation to start. Have you any advice on how to start that conversation on farm succession?
That's a good question, Catherine. Sometimes, what I say to farm families are, when I meet them in person and they're wondering how to go home and start the conversation, I give them a booklet. And I say, maybe you start reading that booklet and you leave it on the kitchen table, and maybe somebody else will pick it up and they'll have a look and say, where did you get this? And that might be just enough to start the conversation. So you could ring the local office and get the little booklet that we have produced. It's a green book. It's called A Guide to Transferring the Family Farm. So that might be a starting point. I suppose, I suppose what we should do is try and be upfront with your family members, and your thought processes. There's no harm in talking. We know our own children quite well, and what kind of topics you can broach with them. So, I mean, where farm families do lots of talking around the kitchen table, that's probably the place to start. But sometimes, if you're elderly and your kids are working away, maybe, you need to gather them together, and say you're thinking about dividing up the assets or retiring, and you'd like to know, well, what would they like, or, what are they interested in? Because, young John might want the field at the crossroads, and Mary might want a bit of money to help her with her mortgage. So every family is different. Yeah, and every family will have their own ways maybe of starting conversations and other things. So
it really is farm specific, James. And I suppose you touched on it earlier, but there are a range of ways to integrate farm generations, be it parent and child, aunt and uncle, or niece and nephew, or neighbours, depending on the farm situation. And they have become a popular different collaborations and farm partnerships in recent years. Can you just discuss some of the ways that they have been integrated?
Yeah. So I suppose milk production partnerships started back in, I suppose it must be nearly 20 years ago now, back in the late 2000s. And they progressed on in 2015. The Department of Agriculture widened the milk production partnership so that any two farmers could form a partnership. So if you were a neighbour of mine, Catherine, we could start farming together. And, you have a herd number and I have a herd number, and we could run all the stock in your herd number, and maybe we'd use your milking parlour. And we might use my wintering facilities, for the replacement heifers or whatever. And we do a profit sharing ratio. And, there's incentives there for, if we need to do any building, that there's higher levels of TAMS grant and things like that. And for us to legally do a partnership, there's a grant aid structure as well, to do the legal deal, so that, if we fall out, that, you can divide everything back to where we started, or we get back what we put in. So that's a registered farm partnership. I suppose some people look at other options, like they might decide, right, instead of me farming with you, Catherine, maybe I might lease you the land. Okay, so that's a way of me stepping back. But if I lease you the land, maybe you're going to be tight on labour. Maybe you might give me 5 or 6 hours work a week. So I'm leasing you the land and I'm getting a job off you. So I suppose there's loads of different options out there. I might have a wet field, and we might plant that to forestry, and I might lease out the rest of it. So I have a bit of tax-free income coming from forestry, and I might have some tax-free income coming from a land lease with you. Share farming is another option that people take on, where it's usually in tillage situations. So I will buy the grain and the seed and the sprays, and you will sow the crop, and you will, do the work, and then we'll split the profit at the end of the year. So that's another type of farming that people do. So there's lots of options out there. On last year's Transferring the Farm webinar, Gordon Peppard, our specialist, actually spoke specifically on collaborative farming. So if you want to review his talk, if people go onto the website, they'll be able to view that again. And there's also booklets, and there's a resource page. I'd say if you Google Teagasc and collaborative farming, you'll probably get into the resource page on the website, and there's loads more information there too.
That's great, James. And there's a series of Transferring the Family Farm webinars coming up in the coming weeks. Can you tell me more about them?
Yeah, I suppose as a follow-on from last year, due to COVID, what we used to do was go around to hotel rooms, and we do 6 or 7 hotels a year in different counties, and we'd have solicitors and accountants and mediators. We'd have all the different professionals available for people to talk to free of charge. So last year we decided to start with a webinar. So I suppose I did a short presentation on teeing up the farmer and what questions they might ask. And we had a tax presentation, and we had a collaborative farming presentation. So as a follow-on from that, this year on the 6th of October, we will have a solicitor and a mediator making 2 presentations. And then on the 13th of October, we're going to have a discussion on the Fair Deal Scheme and pensions and what entitlements and how to find out. So there'll be in the evening time. So I think it's 7 o'clock start. You can register on the website. The chances are that the webinar will run for about an hour. People can ask questions through a chat function. But I think it's only the first 1,000 can get in to ask questions on the chat function. After that, you're on an email, and we'll keep an eye on the email. And that's live at any stage. But I suppose talk to your advisor if you have a question. And we also have succession@teagasc.ie as our email address, and that'll be live and be monitored on the night. Last year, we got a lot of questions, and I think it took us maybe 2 weeks to get back to everybody that had asked a question, because we couldn't get through them all in the night. Sometimes people will ask very personal questions, so those questions won't be answered live. But if there are simple or generic questions, we'll answer those live on the webinar. So the 6th of October and the 13th of October are our 2 webinars, and they're called Transferring the Family Farm. Click on the events page on the website. It's another way to book.
Thanks, James. I look forward to tuning in on the 6th and the 13th of October. And listeners can register on the Teagasc website, and I'll include the link in the podcast text.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for the opportunity to go on your podcast.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to James for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.